Some stories stay with us, not because they are grand or unbelievable, but because they remind us of something deeply true, the power of a simple, selfless act. At the edge of a quiet town, where houses gave way to whispering trees, lived a child named Oliver. He wasn't the type to stay indoors for long. The forest, with its endless secrets and ever-changing moods, felt more like home than anywhere else. Every chance he got, he'd slip away from the paved streets and into the world of rustling leaves and dappled sunlight. Oliver wasn't reckless, though. His parents always made sure he carried a small backpack whenever he wandered into woods, just in case. It always held the same things: a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a packed lunch. He rarely needed the flashlight, and the water usually came back half full, but the lunch? That was his favorite part, not just for himself, but for the creatures he imagined sharing it with. He had a habit of bringing extra food, not because he expected to be out long, but because he liked the idea of sharing. Sometimes he left crumbs for the birds. Other times, he'd place a piece of fruit on a tree stump, hoping a squirrel might find it. He never saw them take the food, but he liked knowing it was out there, a small kindness left behind. One afternoon, the golden light of late autumn streamed through the trees as Oliver made his way along his usual path. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine needles, and the world felt peaceful, untouched. He climbed over a fallen log, his boots crunching softly against the leaves, and found the perfect spot to sit, a large, flat rock near the stream. As he unwrapped his sandwich, something shifted in the air, a quiet stillness, different from the natural hush of the forest. It was a kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, not out of fear, but out of something else. Awareness. Then a sound, a slow, careful rustling in the underbrush. Oliver froze, his breath caught between curiosity and caution. He turned his head, scanning the tree line. At first he saw nothing, just the shadows stretching between the trunks, the sway of branches in the breeze. But then, just beyond the clearing, something moved. A shape, large, dark, and unmistakably alive. His heart beat faster as the figure stepped forward, revealing itself. A bear, thin, weary, and watching with eyes that held something unexpected. Not aggression, not fear, but hunger. Deep, aching hunger. Oliver's fingers tightened around his sandwich, and in that moment he had a choice. And he already knew what he was going to do. Oliver's breath came in shallow, careful inhales. He had never been this close to a bear before. It wasn't like the playful cubs he had seen on nature documentaries, tumbling over each other in the safety of their dens. This bear was different, gaunt, its fur dull and unkempt, ribs faintly visible beneath its thick coat. It didn't lunge. It didn't growl. It just stood there, watching. Oliver swallowed hard. Every lesson he had ever heard about wild animals echoed in his mind. Stay still. Don't run. Don't make sudden movements. But there was something in the way the bear looked at him, not with the sharp glint of a predator, but with the quiet desperation of something that had been searching for too long and finding too little. His fingers loosened around his sandwich. Slowly, carefully, he tore off a piece of bread. The bear's nose twitched, catching the scent. Its deep brown eyes locked onto food. Oliver hesitated. This was a wild animal, a massive, powerful creature. But in this moment, it wasn't a threat. It was just hungry. Keeping his movements deliberate, he set the small piece of sandwich on the rock beside him, then slid back slightly, putting space between himself and the offering. The bear didn't move right away. It sniffed the air again, then took a single, hesitant step forward. Its claws clicked softly against the rocks as it advanced, still watching Oliver, as if expecting him to snatch the food away at the last second. He didn't. The bear lowered its head, nostrils flaring, and with surprising gentleness, it picked up the piece of bread between its teeth. It chewed slowly, as though savoring the taste, and when it swallowed, its gaze flickered back to Oliver. Something inside him ached. He knew what real hunger looked like. He had seen stray dogs in town, their ribs showing through their fur, rummaging through trash bins for scraps. But this was different. This bear wasn't scavenging in garbage or stealing from humans. It had come from the depths of the forest, surviving off what little nature still had to offer. And it wasn't enough. without another thought. Oliver reached into his backpack and pulled out the rest of his sandwich. The bear tensed slightly but didn't retreat. He placed the food on the rock again, this time a little farther away from him. The bear moved forward, its great body casting a shadow over the stone. This time, there was no hesitation. It took the sandwich in a single bite, chewing carefully. For a moment, it almost seemed grateful. Oliver barely breathed. He knew he should be afraid, that any wrong move could change the outcome of this moment. But he wasn't. He was in awe. The bear finished eating, licked its lips, then lifted its head. Their eyes met again. And then, as silently as it had come, the bear turned and lumbered back into the trees. Oliver sat there, heart pounding, staring after it. The forest was quiet once more, but something had changed. Oliver remained still, listening to fading sound of the bear's heavy footsteps as they melted into the rustling leaves. The forest around him, which had held its breath just moments before, slowly exhaled. Birds resumed their quiet songs, branches swayed gently in the breeze, and the world returned to what had been, except for Oliver. Something inside him felt different. He had just fed a bear, a real bear, and it hadn't been scary, not in the way adults always warned. It hadn't roared, chased him, or bared its teeth. It had simply been hungry. Oliver let out a long breath, realizing only now how fast his heart had been beating. He turned back to his backpack, his fingers brushing against the empty sandwich wrapper. He had given the bear his entire lunch without hesitation, and yet he didn't feel hungry. Instead, he felt full of something he couldn't quite name. Excitement? Wonder? A part of him wanted to run home and tell everyone what had happened, but another part hesitated. Would they even believe him? Adults were always cautious about the woods. They spoke of wild animals as dangers, not as living creatures with needs and fears of their own. If he told them he had shared his lunch with a bear, they might scold him, tell him he had been reckless. So, for now, he decided to keep the memory as his own, a secret tucked between him and the forest. As he stood up, dusting leaves from his jeans, his eyes flickered toward the trees where the bear had disappeared. He wondered if it would remember him, if it would ever come back. The thought made him smile. With one last glance at the quiet, sunlit clearing, Oliver slung his backpack over his shoulders and started the familiar path home. That night, as he lay in bed, the day's events replayed in his mind. The weight of the bear's gaze, the slow trust it had shown, the way it had turned to leave without fear or aggression. It all felt too real to be just a one-time moment. And deep in his heart, Oliver had a feeling. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Morning light filtered through Oliver's window, casting golden patterns on his blankets. He blinked awake, the lingering warmth of a dream fading from his mind. For a moment, he wasn't sure why he felt so expectant. Then it hit him. The bear. He sat up, heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Would it still be out there? Would it even remember him? The thought pulled him from bed faster than usual. He threw on his clothes, grabbed his backpack, and hurried downstairs. His mom was already in the kitchen, flipping pancakes. "You're up early," she said, glancing at him with mild surprise. Oliver nodded, grabbing an apple from the counter. "Just want to go for a walk before breakfast." His mom frowned slightly, but didn't question it. "Be back soon," she reminded him. He was already out the door. The woods felt different this morning. Not in an eerie way, but in the way that something new was waiting to be found. The air was crisp with early autumn chill, the leaves crunching under his boots as he walked the familiar path. When he reached the clearing, his breath caught. There, in the very spot where he had shared his lunch, something unusual sat atop the rock. A gift. Oliver stepped closer, his pulse quickening. On the flat stone surface lay a small pile of forest treasures, bright red berries, an acorn, and a carefully placed pine cone. His heart thumped hard against his ribs. The bear. Had it brought this? He looked around, searching the dense trees for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the quiet hush of morning. But he felt it, that same presence from yesterday, lingering just beyond sight. Slowly, Oliver reached out and picked up the pine cone. It wasn't just any pine cone. It had been placed there deliberately, It was a response, a silent message. His stomach flipped with excitement. Had the bear thanked him? A wide grin spread across his face. Carefully, he placed the apple from his backpack on the rock in return. Then, with one last glance into the trees, he turned and walked back home, his mind spinning with the impossible wonder of it all. Something miraculous was happening, and it was only just beginning. For the rest of the day, Oliver could hardly think of anything else. His fingers kept drifting to the pine cone in his pocket, rolling its rough edges between his fingertips as if to convince himself it was real. That night, as the house settled into quiet, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His heart buzzed with a question he couldn't shake. Would the bear come back again? The thought was impossible to ignore. By the time morning arrived, Oliver had already made up his mind. He packed an extra sandwich, a few apple slices, and a handful of nuts into his backpack before slipping out the door. The walk to the clearing felt different this time. He wasn't just wandering anymore. He had a purpose. His steps were light, eager, but when he reached the rock, he froze. The apple he had left yesterday? Gone. And in its place, another gift, a smooth, round stone, darker than any Oliver had seen in the forest. It was polished, almost as if the river had been shaping it for years before it found its way here. Oliver picked it up, running his thumb over the cool surface. His chest filled with something warm, something indescribable. He wasn't imagining this. It was real. He set his backpack down and, just like before, placed his offering, this time the sandwich, on the rock. Then he sat a few feet away, waiting. Minutes passed. The wind moved gently through the trees. A bird called in the distance. Then movement. A shadow shifted at the edge of the clearing. Oliver held his breath. The bear stepped forward, just as careful as the day before. Its dark eyes flickered between Oliver and the sandwich, assessing. Oliver stayed still. The bear took another step, and another, until it reached the rock. It sniffed the food, hesitated, then took it in one slow bite. Oliver exhaled, smiling softly. For the first time, the bear didn't retreat right away. It chewed, watching him, its ears twitching. They sat like that for what felt like forever, boy and bear, sharing a quiet understanding. And in that moment, Oliver knew this wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a beginning of something much, much more. As the days passed, the strange exchange between Oliver and the bear became something of a quiet ritual. Each morning, he'd wake early, slip out before breakfast, and make his way to the clearing. And each time, without fail, a new gift would be waiting for him on the rock. Shiny pebbles, feathers, even a delicate cluster of dried leaves arranged in a pattern too intentional to be random. And every day, he'd leave something in return. A piece of fruit, a slice of bread, a handful of nuts. The bear always came, but it no longer hesitated at the edge of the trees. It would emerge with slow confidence, its deep brown eyes meeting Oliver's before stepping forward to accept the food. They never spoke, of course, but words weren't necessary. One crisp morning, Oliver arrived at the clearing earlier than usual, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bear before it left its offering. He crouched behind a tree, his breath visible in the cool air. The forest was still, hushed in that strange way it sometimes was when something magical was about to happen. And then, movement. The bear appeared, emerging from the trees with the slow grace of something that belonged to the wild. It carried something carefully in its jaws. Oliver's heart pounded. The bear approached the rock and gently placed its gift down, a small bundle of bright red berries, still clinging to their stems. It sniffed the air once, then turned its head, eyes scanning the trees. Oliver held his breath. Did it know he was there? The bear stood still for a long moment. Then, as if sensing it was not alone, it rumbled a low, quiet sound. Not a growl, not a warning. Something softer. A sound Oliver somehow understood. Then, with one last glance around, it disappeared into the trees once more. Oliver stepped forward, his heart racing. He picked up the berries, studying them in awe. Something deep inside him whispered that this was no longer just about food. This was trust, a connection, and it was growing stronger with every passing day. Oliver couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The bear hadn't just left a gift. It had looked for him. It had sensed him. That evening, he sat on his bed, turning the small cluster of berries over in his hands. His mind buzzed with questions. Why was the bear doing this? Could animals really feel friendship like humans do? There was only one way to find out. The next morning, Oliver packed his usual offering, an apple and sandwich, but this time he also brought something else, a single, careful idea forming in his mind. When he arrived at the clearing, the bear was already there. His breath hitched. It stood near the rock, sniffing the air as if it had been waiting for him. When its eyes met his, something shifted, something subtle but unmistakable. Oliver hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward, slowly, deliberately. Instead of placing the sandwich on the rock as he had always done, he knelt down and stretched out his hand, the food resting lightly in his palm. A test of trust. The bear froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Oliver could feel his pulse drumming in his ears, but he forced himself to stay still. Then, cautiously, the bear took a step closer. Another. The air between them was thick with something fragile, something that could shatter with a single wrong move. But Oliver didn't flinch, didn't pull away. The bear's nose twitched, its breath warm against Oliver's fingers. Then, so gently it hardly seemed real, it took the sandwich from his hand. Oliver barely breathed. The bear chewed slowly, watching him all the while. And when it finished, it didn't retreat. Instead, it lowered its great head just slightly, exhaling away that ruffled Oliver's hair. A quiet moment, an unspoken understanding. Then, as if satisfied, the bear turned and lumbered back into trees. Oliver sat there, heart pounding. His fingers still tingled where the bear's whiskers had brushed against them. He had fed a wild bear from his own hand, and it had trusted him. Oliver's world felt different after that morning. The moment the bear had taken food from his hand wasn't just an encounter. It was proof. Proof that trust, real trust, could exist between two beings who were never meant to understand each other. And now, every time he stepped into the clearing, he felt that bond growing stronger. The days turned cooler, the crispness of autumn deepening. The leaves burned with reds and oranges, carpeting the forest floor in a soft mosaic of color. The bear came more often now, as if sensing the changing season, as if knowing food would soon become scarce. One morning, Oliver decided to stay longer than usual. He arrived with an extra sandwich, a handful of peanuts, and a thermos of warm tea just for himself. He settled onto a fallen log, waiting, watching. It didn't take long. The bear emerged from the trees, moving with the same quiet assurance it always did. But this time, instead of going straight to the rock, it hesitated. Oliver's breath caught. It was watching him. Slowly, he reached into his bag, pulling out the sandwich. Instead of stretching his hand out as before, he placed it beside him on the log. Then, without moving too fast, he scooted over just a little, leaving space. An invitation. The bear took a step forward. Then another. Oliver's pulse drummed in his ears, but he stayed still. The bear sniffed the air, its dark eyes flickering between Oliver and the sandwich. And then, with a quiet sort of confidence, it sat down, right beside him. Oliver nearly forgot how to breathe. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the moment stretching between them. He could hear the bear's steady breathing, feel the warmth of its presence beside him. Slowly, it leaned down, taking the sandwich in its teeth. Oliver smiled. For the first time, it wasn't just about food. They weren't just a boy and a bear anymore. They were something else, something deeper, something that didn't need words. And in that quiet clearing, surrounded by golden leaves and crisp autumn air, Oliver knew this friendship was real. It was extraordinary, and it was theirs alone. As the days grew colder, Oliver knew their time together was changing. The bear was eating more, its coat thickening in preparation for winter. The first frost had come, leaving the grass stiff underfoot in the early mornings. Soon, the bear would leave, disappearing into the deep quiet of hibernation. Oliver didn't want to say goodbye, but he also understood. One morning, he arrived at the clearing with an extra special offering, a honey-covered biscuit wrapped in a napkin. He placed it on the rock as usual, but this time, instead of stepping back, he sat cross-legged on the ground, waiting. The bear arrived soon after, its presence as steady and familiar as the rustling wind. It approached the rock, sniffed a biscuit, then turned its gaze toward Oliver. Something was different today. The bear didn't just take the food and leave. Instead, it stepped closer, closer than ever before. Oliver held still as the bear stretched its great head forward and nudged his arm. Warm breath, soft fur against the skin. A thank you in the only way it knew how. A lump rose in Oliver's throat. He reached out, just for a second, and let his fingers graze the bear's thick coat. It wasn't just an animal anymore. It was his friend. They stayed like that for a long moment, boy and bear, silent in their understanding. Then, with one final glance, the bear turned and retreated into the trees. Oliver watched it go, knowing in his heart this wasn't an ending. It was a promise. The bear would return when the snow melted, when the earth softened, when the world was ready for something new. And when that day came, Oliver would be waiting. Because some friendships, no matter how unlikely, are meant to last a lifetime.